She asked for scraps and a corner to sleep, but the rich rancher's daughter called her Mama before anyone could have predicted such an unlikely bond. Life's most profound connections often emerge from the most desperate circumstances, weaving tales that challenge our understanding of family. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The merciless Colorado winter showed no compassion as Mary Smith fought her way through knee-deep snow. Each labored step sank into the pristine white blanket covering the high country, her tattered cloak offering little protection against the biting wind. Her once sturdy boots were now sodden, her fingers numb, and her lips had taken on an alarming bluish tint. Still, her eyes remained clear and determined as she spotted the faint glow of lamplight through the swirling snowfall. The journey had stripped her of everything except her dignity. When she finally reached the weathered porch of Robert Johnson's ranch house, Mary paused to gather what little strength remained. The wood creaked beneath her weight as she approached the door, raising a trembling hand to knock. Robert answered with suspicion etched into the lines of his face. The rancher's broad shoulders filled the doorframe, his expression hardening at the sight of the bedraggled stranger. Mary stood tall, despite her exhaustion, her voice remarkably steady. "I can sleep in the barn. I just need to stay warm. Please," she said, neither begging nor demanding, simply stating her need with quiet resolve. Robert's weathered hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he kept behind the coat rack, a habit formed from years of protecting what little remained of his world. The high country had taught him harsh lessons about trust and loss. He'd expected trouble when he heard the knock, perhaps one of the drifters from town or worse. Instead, he found a woman who looked as though the next strong gust might carry her away. His mouth opened to refuse her when a small figure appeared behind him. His 4-year-old daughter Sarah, with sleep-tousled hair and bare feet poking out beneath her nightgown, pushed past his protective stance. The child's eyes widened as she took in the stranger on their doorstep. "Mama," she whispered, the word hanging in the frozen air between them. Robert felt his heart constrict painfully. Sarah hadn't spoken that word since the avalanche took his wife. He placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, ready to correct her, to explain that this snow-covered woman was nothing to them, certainly not the mother Sarah had lost. But something in the way Sarah stared at Mary made the words die in his throat. The little girl's expression held none of the confusion he expected, only a strange, unsettling certainty that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Mary herself seemed frozen, not from the cold, but from the child's unexpected greeting. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. Robert Johnson's heart clenched as Sarah pressed closer to the strange woman standing on their porch. The child's small feet were pink with cold against the wooden floorboards, her nightgown fluttering in the bitter Colorado wind that swept through the open doorway. "She's not your mother, Sarah," he murmured, his voice catching slightly on the words. His daughter had been without a mother since the avalanche took Elizabeth 2 winters ago, and her sudden attachment to this vagabond woman made his chest tight with complicated emotions. But Sarah shook her head with the stubborn certainty only a 4-year-old could possess. "She smells like the dream I had," she insisted, her eyes wide with hope and something deeper, recognition. "The one where Mama said someone would come to help us not be sad anymore." The woman, Mary, flinched at the child's words but said nothing in response. Her eyes, though exhausted, remained alert and wary. Robert studied her more carefully now, noticing details beyond the initial impression of desperation. Her hands were cracked and trembling, with dirt embedded in the fine lines of her knuckles. A small streak of dried blood stained the leather of her worn boots. Though whether it was hers or from some other hardship of the trail, he couldn't tell. Most striking was the stubborn tilt of her chin. Despite her plea for mere scraps and shelter, there was dignity in her posture that spoke of someone used to standing her ground. Not a common beggar then, Something else. Something that made the rancher both curious and cautious. Sarah took another step forward, reaching out one small hand toward the stranger's tattered cloak. The gesture broke something in Robert's resolve. He couldn't turn away a woman in this weather, not with his daughter watching, not with night falling and the temperature dropping fast. "There's straw in the barn's far corner," he said, his voice tight with reluctance. "It's dry there. I'll bring out a blanket." Relief flickered across Mary's face, but she quickly masked it, giving only a slight nod of acknowledgement. She didn't smile or thank him profusely as he might have expected. Instead, she seemed to accept his grudging hospitality as if it were her due, or perhaps as if she expected it to be rescinded at any moment. Sarah beamed up at her father, approval shining in her eyes. "Can she have some soup first, Papa?" she asked, tugging at his sleeve. Robert sighed, looking between his hopeful daughter and the mysterious woman who had appeared from the storm. "Soup first," he conceded, stepping back to allow Mary Smith across the threshold and into their lives. Mary Smith nodded once, soldier-like, accepting Robert's grudging offer with neither gratitude nor relief visible on her weathered face. She stepped over the threshold just long enough to warm her hands by the crackling fire, her fingers red and trembling as she extended them toward the flames. The heat seemed to pain her at first, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on the dancing embers, revealing nothing of her thoughts or feelings. "The barn has a corner where the draft isn't so bad," Robert said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "There's extra straw in the loft." Mary simply inclined her head, acknowledging his words without meeting his gaze. She didn't ask for food or additional blankets. She didn't explain her circumstances or where she had come from. She simply endured, as though hardship had become so familiar that she no longer expected anything else. After warming her hands for precisely 2 minutes, she straightened her back and moved toward the door. The rancher watched her carefully, noticing how she favored her right leg slightly, though she clearly tried to hide it. The woman paused at the threshold, her silhouette framed against the swirling snow outside. "I'll be gone by morning," she said, her voice low but steady. As Mary crossed the frozen yard toward the barn, Robert stood in the doorway, watching her footprints disappear in the swirling snow almost as quickly as they formed. The wind howled across the Colorado high country, erasing all evidence of her passage. He felt an unexpected pang of concern, wondering if the barn would provide enough shelter against the bitter cold. Closing the heavy wooden door against the storm, Robert turned to find Sarah still standing in her nightgown, her small face solemn in the firelight. He gathered his daughter in his arms, feeling her slight weight against his chest. The child was warm and soft where the stranger had been cold and unyielding. "Time for bed, little one," he murmured, carrying her toward the stairs. But Sarah twisted in his arms to look back at the window, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared into the darkness where Mary had vanished. "She was in my dream, Papa," the child whispered, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "The lady with sad eyes. She was looking for us." Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm. He tightened his arms around his daughter, unsettled by her words and the strange coincidence of this woman appearing on their doorstep. "It was just a dream, Sarah," he said, but his daughter shook her head stubbornly. "No, Papa. I dreamed her before she came. She belongs with us now." That night, the Colorado winter unleashed its full fury. Wind howled through the cracks of Robert Johnson's ranch house, carrying ice crystals that scratched against the windows like desperate fingers. Inside the barn, Mary Smith curled into herself beneath a threadbare blanket, her body forming a tight ball against the cold. Her breath came in shallow puffs, visible in the frigid air, but steady, revealing a woman accustomed to enduring hardship. The straw beneath her crackled with each slight movement, but provided little insulation against the bitter chill seeping through the wooden planks. Still, she didn't complain. Her eyes remained open, staring into the darkness as she listened to the storm's rage, wondering if she'd made the right choice stopping here. Back in the main house, Robert added 3 extra logs to the hearth, watching as the flames leapt higher. He hadn't stoked the fire this generously since Elizabeth passed. The rancher told himself it was practical. The temperature was dropping dangerously low, but he knew the truth. He wasn't building this fire for himself, or even for his daughter Sarah, who slept soundly upstairs. He was hoping some measure of warmth might find its way across the yard to the barn, where the stranger had taken shelter. He settled into his chair, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. The woman's face haunted him, not because of any particular beauty, though her features held a certain quiet dignity, but because of the way she had stood on his porch, straight back despite her obvious exhaustion, proud even in her desperate state. "I just need to stay warm," she had said, her voice neither pleading nor demanding. In his years in the high country, Robert had seen men driven to their knees by greed, by cold, by the need for forgiveness. He'd witnessed proud men reduced to begging, their hands outstretched for gold, for shelter, for mercy. But he'd never encountered someone who asked for so little, just straw and a corner to sleep, and yet carried themselves with such unbroken dignity. The rancher rubbed his calloused hands together, feeling the rough skin catch against itself. Sarah's whispered "mama" echoed in his mind, stirring emotions he'd tried to bury beneath the snow alongside his wife. The child had never called anyone that since Elizabeth's passing. Outside, the wind screamed across the ridge. Robert poured his cold coffee into the sink and checked that his rifle was within reach. Old habits died hard. Then he added one final log to the fire before heading upstairs, leaving the flames burning bright enough to cast a faint glow toward the barn where Mary slept, head held high even in slumber. Morning came pale and silent, with light filtering through the barn's weathered slats. Mary Smith stepped from the shelter with snow dusting her shoulders and a lingering silence on her lips. Her dress was still damp from yesterday's journey, clinging uncomfortably to her skin, and her fingers had turned an angry red from the biting cold. Robert Johnson stood waiting on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee clutched in his calloused hand. The rancher had risen earlier than usual, sleep eluding him as thoughts of the mysterious woman in his barn circled his mind throughout the night. "You're up early," he said gruffly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid Colorado air. "Didn't sleep much," Mary replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. She maintained that upright posture that had struck him the night before, dignity intact even in desperation. Robert extended the mug toward her. "Thought you might need this." She hesitated before accepting, wrapping her reddened fingers around the worn ceramic. The small act of kindness seemed to surprise her, as though she'd expected nothing but the bare minimum he'd promised. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a careful sip. The morning light revealed details hidden by last night's darkness. A thin face with sharp cheekbones, clothes worn threadbare but meticulously mended, and eyes that remained alert despite obvious fatigue. "You got a name?" Robert asked, leaning against the porch railing. The woman's gaze drifted across the snow-covered landscape, something like confusion flickering across her features. "I think it's Mary," she finally answered, her voice softer than before. "That's all I remember." Robert's brow furrowed. "You don't remember your own name?" "I remember the name Mary," she clarified, meeting his eyes with unexpected directness. "But there are gaps, things I can't quite reach." Before he could respond, the cabin door creaked open behind him. Sarah appeared in her nightgown, her small face lighting up at the sight of the stranger. "You stayed!" the child exclaimed, rushing forward despite the cold. Robert moved to stop his daughter, but the 4-year-old had already reached Mary, looking up at her with unguarded hope. "Sarah, get back inside before you catch your death," he called, but his words lacked conviction as he watched the woman kneel to the child's level. "Good morning," Mary said softly, her expression gentling in a way it hadn't for him. As Robert watched this interaction, Something tightened in his chest. Wariness, perhaps, or something else entirely. This woman with no past had somehow connected with his daughter in a way he hadn't seen since Elizabeth's passing. Sarah rushed across the weathered floorboards, her tiny arms wrapping around Mary's waist with such immediate trust that Robert felt his breath catch. The child's face pressed against the stranger's tattered dress, eyes closed in something like relief. "You're warm," Sarah whispered, her voice muffled against the fabric. Robert Johnson watched the scene with growing unease. Complications. He'd spent 2 years meticulously avoiding them since the avalanche that had swept Elizabeth away, leaving nothing but silence and a child who barely spoke. Now this woman, this Mary Smith, had appeared from nowhere, and his daughter clung to her like a lifeline. "I can work," Mary said quietly, her eyes meeting his over Sarah's head. "I'll earn my keep if you let me stay a while longer, just until the worst of the storm passes." Robert's jaw tightened. "And then what?" "Then I'll move on," she answered simply. He should refuse. Every instinct honed by loss told him to protect what little remained of his world. But Sarah's fingers were curled into the fabric of Mary's dress with a determination he hadn't seen since before Elizabeth died. "Fine," he muttered. "But the first sign of trouble—" "I understand." Mary nodded, her posture straightening slightly. By midday, Robert found himself watching from the window as Mary swept snow from the porch with efficient strokes. Her movements were practiced, almost mechanical, yet there was a grace to her labor. When she finished, she immediately started shoveling a narrow path to the well, her breath forming clouds in the frigid Colorado air. Inside, the dishes from breakfast were already washed and stacked neatly by the stove. The floor had been swept. The rancher ran his hand along the clean surface of the table, surprised by the thoroughness of her work. Through the window, he spotted Sarah trailing after Mary like a shadow, carrying a small bucket that was clearly too heavy for her. Instead of sending the child away, Mary adjusted her pace, occasionally stopping to let Sarah catch up. "She's good with her," Robert whispered to himself, unsure whether this was a comfort or a concern. When they returned, Sarah's cheeks were flushed with cold and something else, a spark of life that had been missing for too long. The child's devotion to Mary was growing fiercer by the hour, her small hand constantly reaching for the woman's fingers or dress. Robert turned away, busying himself with mending a bridle that didn't need fixing. He wasn't ready for this, for the way Mary's presence was already shifting the careful emptiness he'd constructed. But watching his daughter hum softly while helping Mary hang wet clothes by the fire, he couldn't bring himself to send the stranger away. By the third evening, the ranch had settled into a new rhythm. Sarah Johnson refused to sleep unless Mary was close by, her small hands clutching at the woman's worn dress whenever bedtime approached. The child's attachment had grown with startling speed, as though some invisible thread connected them. "Story first," Sarah insisted, her eyes wide and pleading as Robert attempted to tuck her beneath the patchwork quilt alone. When he tried to reason with her, tears welled up immediately, her bottom lip trembling with genuine distress. "I need Mama to tell it," she whispered, the word Mama hanging in the air between them. Robert's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside when Mary appeared in the doorway, hesitant yet somehow belonging. At supper, the pattern continued. Sarah wouldn't touch her stew until Mary sat beside her, one weathered hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. Only then would she lift the spoon to her mouth, smiling between bites as though guarding a precious secret. "You sure she ain't bewitched her?" Robert grumbled later that night as he and Mary stood in the kitchen, voices low to avoid waking his daughter. The rancher's eyes betrayed his confusion, part suspicion, part wonder at the transformation in Sarah. "Never seen her take to anyone like this. Not since—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mary folded a dish towel with careful precision. "I haven't done anything to earn it," she said softly. "I wish I understood it myself." Their conversation was interrupted when Sarah padded into the kitchen in her nightgown, overhearing her father's words. The child shook her head with surprising conviction. "She's just safe," she said simply, as though explaining something obvious to adults too complicated to understand. "Like when the blanket's warm and the snow can't get you." Robert's expression softened as he watched his daughter take Mary's hand and lead her toward the washing basin. Together, they began drying the supper plates, Sarah standing on a small wooden stool to reach. For the first time since Elizabeth died, he noticed his daughter humming softly, a lullaby his late wife used to sing. The tune drifted through the cabin, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. Mary didn't know the melody, but she moved in harmony with Sarah's rhythm, their hands working in tandem as though they'd done this 1,000 times before. Robert leaned against the doorframe, watching. Something tight in his chest began to loosen, like ice giving way to spring. The embers glowed in the hearth as Robert Johnson stoked the dying fire. The ranch house creaked under the weight of another winter night, snow piling against the windows. He glanced toward the kitchen where Mary Smith stood near the stove, her back to him as she brushed her dress free of the day's dust. Her movements were methodical, practiced, a woman who knew hardship but carried herself with dignity. As she reached up to adjust her hair, her thick braids slipped to one side, revealing something that made Robert's breath catch. There, just behind her neck, was a thin, pale scar, unmistakably a bullet wound. The rancher's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he kept propped against the wall. His mind raced with possibilities. What kind of woman survived a gunshot to the neck? What life had she fled? The scar was old, healed over, but its presence told a story Mary herself couldn't or wouldn't share. "Need more kindling?" Mary asked, turning suddenly. Her eyes, sharp and observant, caught his expression before he could mask it. "No," Robert replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Just making sure the fire lasts through the night. Gets cold in the barn." She nodded once, her fingers unconsciously touching the spot where the scar hid beneath her collar. "I've known colder." After Mary returned to the barn and Sarah was tucked safely in bed, Robert sat alone at the kitchen table, sleep a distant possibility. The woman was a contradiction, gentle with his daughter, yet hardened by something he couldn't name. Sarah called her mama with such conviction, it sometimes startled even Mary herself. He poured himself a small measure of whiskey, contemplating the three of them caught in this strange arrangement, a woman with no past, a child desperate for a mother's love, and himself, a widower clinging to caution like a shield. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Robert rose, gathered 2 extra woolen blankets from the chest, and pulled on his coat. The barn door creaked as he entered, lantern held low. Mary was already asleep, curled tightly on her side, one hand beneath her cheek, the other resting protectively over the small bundle of her possessions. In sleep, her face lost its guardedness, revealing someone younger than her weathered hands suggested. Robert laid the blankets beside her, without waking her, then paused, studying the mysterious woman who had walked out of the blizzard and into their lives. The scar might speak of violence, but something in him, something he wasn't ready to trust, whispered that Mary Smith was running from danger rather than bringing it to his door. The days melted into one another as January gave way to February. Mary Smith integrated herself into the ranch's daily rhythm with a grace that suggested her body remembered what her mind could not. Her hands knew exactly how to mend a fence, how much feed to give the horses, and the precise temperature at which bread would rise perfectly in the old cast-iron stove. Robert Johnson observed her from the corner of his eye while chopping wood or repairing tack. Though he still kept his rifle within reach at night, his suspicions softened each time he caught Mary lifting Sarah to count stars or teaching the child how to make shadow puppets against the lantern light. The little girl followed the mysterious woman everywhere, her small boots tracking Mary's footprints in the snow with unwavering devotion. "You need dough like my mother did," Robert commented one evening, surprising himself with the admission. Mary's hands paused briefly. "I wish I could tell you where I learned it," she replied, her voice steady, despite the frustration that occasionally clouded her eyes when memories refused to surface. Sarah tugged at Mary's skirt. "Can we make the birds again tomorrow?" she asked, referring to the paper birds Mary had taught her to fold. "Of course," Mary answered, her smile genuine as she brushed flour from the child's cheek. Even as the household settled into this tentative harmony, Robert remained vigilant. He noticed how Mary always positioned herself with her back to a wall, how her eyes scanned the horizon whenever she stepped outside, how she startled at unexpected sounds. She carried herself like someone accustomed to danger, though she worked with the gentleness of a woman who had known peace. On a particularly cold Tuesday morning, while Mary helped Sarah collect eggs from the henhouse, Robert spotted two riders approaching from the South Ridge. His hand instinctively moved toward his belt as he recognized Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's son from town, and beside him, Deputy Wilson, whose reputation for zealous enforcement of the law preceded him. The men's faces were grim as they dismounted, stamping their boots against the cold. Robert stepped onto the porch, deliberately placing himself between the visitors and the path to the henhouse where Mary and Sarah gathered eggs. "Morning, Johnson," the deputy called, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Heard tell there's a woman staying at your place." His eyes narrowed as he scanned the property. "We've got some questions about her." Robert's jaw tightened as he felt the weight of Mary's future settling on his shoulders. Behind the barn, he could see Sarah's red cap bobbing alongside Mary's slender figure, both unaware of the threat that had just ridden up their drive. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge when Robert spotted two riders approaching through the swirling snow. He reached for his rifle instinctively, the worn wood familiar against his palm. Through the frosted window, he recognized the blacksmith's son, Thomas, and beside him, Deputy Wilson from town, their horses leaving deep tracks in the fresh powder. "Best stay inside," Robert told Mary, who nodded silently, her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Sarah clung to her skirts, oblivious to the tension suddenly filling the cabin. The men dismounted, stomping snow from their boots before approaching the porch. Robert stepped outside, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. "Morning, Johnson," Deputy Wilson said, his breath clouding in the cold air. His eyes scanned the property with practiced suspicion. "Heard you've got company these days." Robert crossed his arms. "What brings you all the way up here in this weather?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, while the deputy adjusted his hat. "We heard tell there's a woman staying here, scar behind her ear," the deputy said. "There's a bounty out, armed, dangerous, wanted for courier work during the war. Carrying messages for the wrong side, they say." Robert's jaw tightened as he processed this information. He glanced toward the barn, where just yesterday, Mary had been teaching Sarah how to split kindling, her patient hands guiding his daughter's small ones with gentle care. "No one like that here," Robert replied flatly, his voice steady as the mountains behind them. His eyes met the deputy's, daring the men to argue, to push past him into his home. After a tense silence, broken only by the sound of a horse pawing at the snow, the men exchanged glances. "Well then," Deputy Wilson said finally, "you let us know if you see anyone matching that description." He turned his horse, adding, "Folks in town are talking, Johnson. Be careful who you shelter." Robert watched them ride away, their curiosity unsatisfied but warning delivered. Only when they disappeared beyond the tree line did he return inside. Mary stood by the window, her face pale. Sarah had wandered to her wooden toys, humming softly to herself. "You lied for me," Mary said quietly, her eyes meeting Robert's, searching, afraid, yet somehow hopeful. Robert hung his coat on the rack, considering his words carefully. "I told them what I believed to be true. But the scar, a scar only tells me you survived," he answered, his voice softening. "It doesn't tell me who you are." Mary's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the worry remained etched in her features. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of the visitors, blanketing their accusations in pristine white. Mary's hands trembled as she stared at the closed door where the deputy had stood moments before. The accusation hung in the air like frost. Armed, dangerous, a woman with a bounty. She pressed her fingers to the scar behind her neck, feeling its raised edge for the first time with true fear. What if I am dangerous, Robert? What if I just forgot? Her voice cracked, the composure she'd maintained since arriving at the ranch finally splintering. I can't remember who I was, but what if that person deserved to be hunted? Robert Johnson knelt beside her on the worn floorboards, his presence solid as the mountains surrounding them. His eyes, usually guarded and distant, now held a certainty that steadied her. "Then we'll find out," he said simply, "but I won't let someone else write your story." He placed his calloused hand over hers, rough fingers gentle against her skin. "The woman I've watched these past days splits wood in the morning frost, teaches Sarah to count stars, and mends clothes by candlelight. That's not someone I fear." Mary Langston blinked rapidly, unexpected tears blurring her vision. No one had defended her, at least not that she could remember. The weight of unknown sins had pressed upon her shoulders since she'd awakened in that Colorado mining town, with nothing but a name she wasn't certain belonged to her. "But how can you be sure?" she whispered. "I'm not," Robert admitted, "but Sarah is." As if summoned by her name, the door burst open, and Sarah ran in, cheeks flushed from the cold, her small boots tracking snow across the floor. In her cupped palms, she carried a single, perfect snowflake, already melting at the edges. "Mama, it's for you," the child whispered reverently, extending her hands toward Mary. "I caught it special." Something in Mary steadied at the sight of the little girl's earnest face. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, her composure broke not from fear, but from relief, a warmth spreading through her chest despite the winter chill. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured, bending to examine the delicate crystal before it dissolved completely. Robert watched them, his expression softening. "Sarah's been right about things before," he said quietly. "Her mother used to say she had an old soul." Mary gently touched the child's hair, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her forgotten past didn't define her. Perhaps she could be the person Sarah saw, someone worthy of trust, of love, of being called Mama by a child who needed one. That night the wind screamed across the pass like a wounded animal. Robert Johnson jolted awake, not from the howling storm, but from the sound of small feet running down the hallway. Sarah burst into his room, her face streaked with tears, clutching her wooden fox against her nightgown. "She's gone, Papa," the child sobbed, her voice breaking. "Mama's gone." Robert's heart sank as he threw back the blankets. He rushed to the barn, Sarah trailing behind him despite his protest to stay inside. The lantern light revealed what he feared. Mary's bedroll lay empty, the rough blanket tossed aside. The barn door swung violently in the wind, banging against the wall with each gust. "Stay here," he commanded, guiding his daughter back toward the house. "I'll find her." Sarah clutched his hand. "Promise you'll bring her back?" The rancher nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. He tucked Sarah safely inside, stoked the fire, and grabbed his heavy coat. The cold bit through his clothes as he stepped into the blizzard, lantern held high to illuminate the faint impressions in the fresh snow. Hurried footprints heading not toward town, but up the ridge. "Mary," he called, his voice swallowed by the wind. The snow came down in blinding sheets as Robert followed the trail. Trees emerged from the darkness like specters, their branches heavy with ice. His boots slipped on the steepening slope, but he pressed forward, one hand shielding the lantern's flame. His breath came in ragged clouds as he passed the old pine where Elizabeth had once loved to sit and watch the valley below. The footprints grew shallower as the wind erased them. Robert's fear deepened with each step. Had Mary fled because of the strangers asking questions? Had her memories returned, pulling her away from them? Or was something darker at work, Had she gone to the ridge not to escape, but to end her suffering? He remembered the haunted look in her eyes when the deputy mentioned the bounty. The way she'd flinched when Sarah first called her mama. The careful distance she maintained even while growing closer to them. "Mary Langston!" he shouted against the howling wind, using the name she might remember, hoping it would reach her. The cold burned his lungs as he climbed higher, past the place where avalanches had claimed so many lives, including his wife's. The lantern flickered dangerously as Robert pushed forward, following what remained of Mary's trail, praying he wasn't too late to bring her home. Robert found Mary standing at the edge of the snowy bluff, her coat flapping violently in the wind like a distress flag. Her face, illuminated by the moonlight, was pale and tear-streaked, her eyes fixed on the vast darkness below. The rancher approached cautiously, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. "I woke up and couldn't breathe," Mary confessed, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "The walls were closing in. I needed air." She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, not from cold, but from something deeper. What if the man in town was right? What if I did something terrible and forgot? What if I'm running from something I deserve? Robert Johnson stepped closer, careful not to startle her. The ridge dropped away sharply, just feet from where she stood. The same overlook where Elizabeth had once loved to watch summer storms roll in. Now it looked ominous, a void of white and black stretching into nothingness. "Or what if you were good and brave, and someone lied?" he countered, his voice warm as fire against the bitter cold. "I've seen how you are with Sarah, how you split wood until your hands blister, how you wake before dawn to make sure the stove is lit." He paused, watching her shoulders tremble. Those aren't the actions of someone who deserves to be hunted. Mary shuddered, doubt written deep in her eyes as she finally turned to face him. Snowflakes caught in her eyelashes, melting with her tears. "I don't even know my own name," she whispered. "Mary Smith feels borrowed, like clothes that don't quite fit. How can I trust myself when I can't remember who I am?" The wind gusted, nearly knocking her sideways. Robert instinctively reached out, steadying her with a firm hand on her arm. She didn't pull away. "I know who you are," he said, conviction in every word. "You're the woman who asked for nothing but straw and shelter, the one my daughter recognized before I did." His eyes softened. "The kind who lived through hell and kept going." Mary's breath caught, a small cloud in the frigid air. For a moment, she looked toward the edge again, as if measuring the distance. Then her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. "What if I'm not worth all this trouble?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Robert's answer was simple and unhurried. "You are to Sarah. You are to me." He held out his hand, an invitation rather than a demand. After a long moment, Mary reached out and took it, her fingers cold, but her grip surprisingly strong. Robert Johnson looked at Mary with unwavering certainty in his eyes. "You're the kind who lived through hell and kept going," he said, his voice carrying over the howling wind. The simplicity of his words struck her more powerfully than any elaborate speech could have. Mary's composure finally crumbled. The walls she had built around herself since arriving at the ranch collapsed entirely. Her shoulders shook as she released the sobs she'd been holding back for so long. The tears came freely now, no longer restrained by the need to appear strong. "Maybe it would be easier if I just left," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "For everyone, for Sarah, for you." Her eyes darted toward the edge of the bluff, the darkness beyond seeming almost welcoming in its finality. Robert reached out and gently pulled her away from the precipice. His calloused hands, rough from years of ranch work, were surprisingly tender as they closed around her shoulders. The rancher drew her close, his warmth a stark contrast to the biting cold surrounding them. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," he murmured, his breath forming small clouds between them. "Just stay." The simplicity of his request broke something open inside her. not asking for explanations or promises, just presence. Mary nodded, unable to speak as tears froze on her cheeks in the bitter Colorado night. For the first time since arriving at his door, she allowed herself to lean against him, accepting the support he offered. Together they began the trek back down the ridge, each step carrying them away from the edge and toward something neither had expected to find. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they navigated the path in silence, the ranch house a distant glow of warmth in the valley below. Mary stumbled once on the descent, her exhaustion finally showing. Without comment, Robert steadied her, his hand remaining at her elbow afterward. The gesture wasn't possessive, but protective, a promise without words. As they approached the house, Mary could see Sarah's small face pressed against the window, eyes wide with worry. The child disappeared from view, and seconds later the door flew open. The little girl ran out in her nightgown, heedless of the cold. "You came back," Sarah cried, wrapping her arms around Mary's waist. Mary knelt down, meeting the child at eye level. "I did," she whispered, her voice steadier now. They entered the house together, stepping into the light and warmth of the home Mary never thought she'd find. A place where her past, whatever it might hold, didn't define her future. Morning brought pale sunlight and uneasy silence. Mary pressed her face to the window, watching frost patterns dissolve along the edges. Her reflection stared back, a face she was still learning to recognize as her own. The night had been restless, filled with fragments that felt more like memories than dreams. "I dreamed about letters last night," she told Robert as he stoked the fire. Envelopes sealed with wax, hand-drawn maps hidden between pages. Her fingers traced invisible lines on the table. "I was carrying them somewhere important." Robert Johnson paused, the poker still in his hand. The rancher's eyes held a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Do you remember where?" "No," Mary whispered, "but I remember being afraid, not for myself, but for what would happen if the letters were found." She looked up suddenly, her eyes wide. "Langston, Mary Langston, I believe that's my name." The name hung in the air between them, solid and real. Sarah, hearing voices, padded into the kitchen in her nightgown, clutching her wooden fox. The child climbed onto Mary's lap without hesitation, as if she'd been doing it her entire life. "That's a pretty name," Sarah said, leaning her head against Mary's chest. "Can I still call you Mama?" Mary's throat tightened as she stroked the girl's hair. "Of course you can, little one." That afternoon, while Sarah napped, Robert suggested they search the attic. "Elizabeth kept everything," he explained, his voice catching slightly at his late wife's name. "Letters, newspapers from back east. Might be something there." The attic was dusty and cold, filled with forgotten treasures and memories. Mary moved carefully through the space, drawn to a corner where an old trunk sat beneath the eaves. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a folded quilt, lay a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with faded ribbon. Mary's breath caught as she pulled them out. Each one was addressed in elegant script to Miss Mary Langston. "These are mine," she whispered, running her fingers over the handwriting. "How did they get here?" Robert knelt beside her, his presence steady and warm. "Elizabeth never mentioned knowing you," he said softly, "but she had connections from before we married. She helped people during the war." Mary untied the ribbon with shaking hands and opened the first letter. As she read, tears filled her eyes. The words confirmed what her dreams had been trying to tell her. She had been a courier during the war, carrying messages for those who fought for freedom. "I wasn't running from something," she said, looking up at Robert with wonder in her eyes. "I was part of something important." For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mary felt the weight of uncertainty begin to lift. Her name was Mary Langston, and she had a past worth remembering. Mary's fingers trembled as she unfolded the yellowed papers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet stirred something deep within her memory. Each letter revealed fragments of a past she couldn't fully grasp. coded messages about safe houses, gratitude from unnamed recipients, and references to dangerous missions through enemy territory. Robert Johnson stood behind her, his breath warm against her neck as he peered over her shoulder. The rancher's weathered hands gently steadied hers when a particular letter made her gasp. "You were a courier during the war," he said, voice filled with quiet realization. "These aren't criminal records. They're thank-you notes from people you helped." Mary Langston nodded slowly. Her mind suddenly flooded with fractured images. Riding through moonless nights with vital messages sewn into her coat line. "I remember crossing rivers at midnight," she whispered, "changing horses at farms where lanterns burned in specific windows." Her hand unconsciously moved to the scar behind her ear. "There was a man, someone I trusted. He betrayed our network to the enemy." Robert's fingers brushed against hers, offering silent support as she continued piecing together her past. "I was carrying information about troop movements," Mary said, memories crystallizing with each word. "They ambushed me near a creek crossing. I remember the cold pain of the bullet, then nothing, until I woke up in a stranger's cabin." The rancher's eyes reflected understanding rather than judgment. "That's why you couldn't remember. The trauma." Mary traced the signature on one letter, a simple E with a flourish. "I wasn't running from the law. I was running from memories." Her voice strengthened as clarity washed over her. "My scar isn't proof of violence I caused. It's evidence of what was done to me." Sarah's small footsteps pattered outside the door, reminding them both of the present moment, the life being built within these walls. "I wasn't a criminal," Mary whispered, looking up at Robert with tears gathering in her eyes. "I was a survivor." He nodded, his expression softening as he carefully folded the letter and placed it back in her hands. "You still are," he said simply. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silent witnesses to her revelation, unchanging and steadfast like the truth she'd finally uncovered. The courier, who had once carried secrets for others, had finally delivered the most important message of all, to herself. Robert Johnson held Mary's gaze across the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. The revelation of her past as a wartime courier had shifted something between them, respect deepening into understanding. "You risked your life for words on paper?" he asked, voice low so as not to wake Sarah. Mary traced the grain of the wooden table with her fingertip. "I believed in a cause," she replied, memories flickering behind her eyes, "until it nearly killed me." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the ranch house walls. Outside, the Colorado wind whistled through the eaves, a haunting reminder of how she'd arrived, desperate and frozen, asking only for shelter. "Were you scared?" Robert's question hung in the air between them. Mary nodded slowly. "Every time, but fear keeps you sharp." She touched the scar behind her ear unconsciously. "I carried messages between divided families, battle plans, warnings of raids. Some letters held nothing but a child's drawing for a father who might never return home." Robert watched her face soften at this memory. "You were brave." "I was necessary," she corrected him. "When armies clash, it's the small kindnesses that preserve our humanity." Later that night, after they'd banked the fire and checked the barn doors, Robert stood in the doorway of Sarah's room. The child slept peacefully, one small hand clutching a fistful of Mary's braid. The woman sat beside the bed, humming softly, a lullaby with no words. "She won't let go," Mary whispered, smiling at the sleeping child, even in her dreams. Robert leaned against the doorframe, the moonlight silvering his features. "She knows what I'm just learning. You're someone worth holding on to." Mary's eyes glistened in the dim light. The rancher moved closer, settling into the chair beside her. Between them, Sarah breathed evenly, secure in her newfound attachment. "You still believe in that cause?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. "The one you risked everything for?" Mary looked at the child, then at the man whose home had become her sanctuary. The woman who had once carried secrets across battlefields smiled gently. "I believe in truth and second chances," she said, her words a quiet promise in the darkness. Robert nodded, reaching across Sarah to touch Mary's hand. "So do I." Their fingers intertwined above the sleeping child, and in that moment, Mary Langston understood that her journey had led her exactly where she needed to be. Not to a barn corner or a handful of scraps, but to the heart of a family being reborn. The snowstorm passed, leaving a blanket of silence over the valley. The world seemed to exhale as trees stood tall against the brightening sky, their branches free from winter's heavy burden. One crisp morning, as Mary hung laundry on the line behind the ranch house, she spotted a lone rider approaching from the eastern ridge. Robert Johnson stepped onto the porch, hand instinctively moving toward his rifle before relaxing. "That's James Brown," he said, recognition warming his voice. "Legend from Red Elk Ridge. Hasn't been down this way in years." The old man dismounted with surprising grace despite his weathered appearance. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare, nickered softly as he secured her to the hitching post. Sarah peeked from behind her father's legs, curious but shy. "Mr. Brown," Robert greeted, extending his hand. "What brings you all this way?" James removed his hat, revealing silver hair that caught the morning light. "Got something that's been waiting too long to be delivered," he said, his voice like gravel over velvet. From his saddlebag he withdrew a yellowed envelope, handling it with reverence. "For the lady," he said, nodding toward Mary. "Elizabeth Johnson entrusted this to me before the past claimed her." Mary's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. "Elizabeth? Robert's wife?" James nodded solemnly. "She spoke of you once, said if a woman named Mary Langston ever came through these parts, I was to give you this." Inside the ranch house, with Robert and Sarah sitting close, Mary unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant but strong, much like the woman Robert had described in quiet evening conversations. "If ever you need it, come west," Mary read aloud, her voice catching. "You will always have a place by my fire. The mountains heal what the valleys cannot, and some souls are meant to find each other across time." Robert watched her, his eyes reflecting firelight and memory. Without a word, he rose and retrieved a small wooden box from the mantel. From it, he withdrew a silver dove pendant, its wings outstretched in eternal flight. "Elizabeth wore this," he said softly, placing it in Mary's palm. "She believed doves always find their way home." Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she closed her fingers around the pendant. The metal warmed against her skin, a connection to a woman she'd never met, but who had somehow known she would come. "How could she have known?" Mary whispered. Robert's gaze met hers across the room. "Elizabeth always said some souls recognize each other, even before they meet." James Brown declined their invitation to stay, mounting his horse with a nod toward the horizon. "Some messages take time to deliver," he said, "but they always find their way." The mountain snow melted into rivulets, carving paths through the thawing earth, as spring breathed new life into the Colorado high country. Mary Langston stood in the doorway of the barn, her small bundle of possessions tied with twine. The memories had returned fully now, her work as a courier, the danger, the betrayal, and with them came a restlessness that tugged at her soul. "I can't stay," she whispered to herself, fingers tracing the scar behind her ear. "I don't belong here." She had packed her few belongings at dawn, before Robert or Sarah would wake. The silver dove pendant Elizabeth had left for her hung heavy around her neck, a reminder of kindness she hadn't earned. Mary placed her folded blanket, no longer threadbare thanks to Robert's care, atop a hay bale and turned toward the path leading away from the ranch. The sound of small feet splashing through mud puddles broke the morning silence. Sarah Johnson ran barefoot across the yard, her nightgown spattered with spring mud, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. "Don't go, Mama," the child cried, flinging herself against Mary's legs. "I picked you, I prayed for you every night after Mama went to heaven." Mary knelt in the soft earth, her heart breaking as she cupped Sarah's face. "Sweet girl, I'm not your mother," she said gently, wiping away the child's tears with her thumb. Sarah's chin lifted with stubborn determination. "Yes, you are," she declared, her voice steady despite her tears. "You make the bad dreams go away. You braid my hair like the stars. You're my mama now." Mary closed her eyes against the weight of those words. When she opened them, Robert stood in the doorway of the house, watching. The rancher crossed the yard slowly, his expression unreadable in the early light. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. Mary nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Robert's weathered hands reached into his pocket, retrieving something that caught the morning sun. A simple silver ring lay in his palm, unadorned but gleaming with promise. "You asked for scraps and a corner when you came here," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you gave us so much more. You healed us, Mary. You brought life back to this place." He extended his hand, the ring a question neither of them had dared to ask before. "Will you be my wife?" Robert asked. "Will you stay and be Sarah's mother in truth, not just in her heart?" Mary looked from the ring to Sarah's hopeful face, then to Robert's eyes, eyes that had once held only caution, but now shone with something far warmer. Her tears fell freely as she whispered the only answer her heart would allow. "Yes." The seasons turned like pages in a well-worn book. Spring blossoms gave way to summer heat, then autumn's golden touch, and back to winter's embrace. Through it all, the old storehouse that had once stood abandoned on the ridge transformed under Mary Langston's careful hands. Windows were scrubbed clean, walls whitewashed, and rough-hewn benches arranged in neat rows. The schoolhouse became her canvas and teaching her art. Children from across the valley came trudging through meadows and winding paths, drawn by stories of the kind schoolteacher with quiet strength in her eyes. Mary's laughter, once so rare, now flowed freely as she guided small hands through letters and numbers. The saddlebag that had carried secret messages during darker days now hung on a peg by the door, replaced by chalk and primers and the eager questions of young minds. "Miss Mary knows everything," the children would whisper in awe, unaware of how recently she had known nothing at all, not even her own name. Each afternoon as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Robert would finish his ranch work early and stand waiting at the gate. His weathered face, once permanently etched with grief, now softened with anticipation. Sarah, no longer the fragile 4-year-old who had first called a stranger "Mama," skipped beside him, her wooden fox clutched tightly under one arm. The carved toy, whittled by Robert during those first lonely nights after Elizabeth's passing, had become Sarah's constant companion through this journey of healing. "Do you think she'll tell us about the stars tonight?" Sarah would ask, bouncing on her toes as they watched the path for Mary's return. Their home, which had once echoed with silence and loss, now overflowed with the sounds of life. Sarah's giggles, Mary's humming as she kneaded bread, Robert's deep laugh that had been rediscovered like a treasure long buried. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, watching the Colorado sky paint itself in impossible colors, their hands linked in a chain of chosen family. Sometimes, Mary would touch the silver dove pendant at her throat, Elizabeth's final gift, and wonder at the strange paths that had led her here. From courier to fugitive to teacher, from stranger to mother to wife. The bullet scar behind her ear had faded to a thin white line, a reminder not of what she had survived, but of how far she had come. Out there in the wide, wind-swept west, Mary had found not just shelter from a snowstorm, but a future she could never have imagined, shaped by courage that never faltered, kindness that healed wounds deeper than flesh, and a love as steady and enduring as the mountain winds themselves.